What if the headlines you read every morning, images of missiles, diplomatic rifts, and military posturing, are echoing a script written millennia ago? Not in exact words, not in modern party names, but in a pattern, a rhythm, a prophetic geography that the biblical writers described when empires still rose and fell by the sword and by the decrees of kings. Iran, Israel, and the United States now sit at the center of intense global focus. The Bible, however, names a place called Persia and speaks of nations gathering against Israel. Could there be a connection worth taking seriously? Could ancient prophecy cast light on the alliances and tensions we see today without forcing a direct, simplistic one-to-one mapping? Before we rush to answers, let's set a stable foundation. History matters here, not in the sense of supplying exact modern equivalents, but as the soil out of which the prophetic language grew. Israel's story in exile begins with the Babylonian conquest. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon carried the people of Judah into captivity, an epical rupture described across the prophets and in the book of Daniel. The famous scene of the handwriting on the wall takes place in that world. Daniel 5 tells how a mysterious script appeared during the reign of Belshazzar, pronouncing the end of Babylonian arrogance. That dramatic moment is one hinge in a larger narrative that moves not toward the indefinite triumph of Babylon, but toward a succession of empires that God will use and, in due time, displace. That succession matters because much of biblical prophecy is about patterns rather than isolated events. After Babylon comes the Medo-Persian Empire. It is the Medes and Persians, under the figure of Cyrus, who ultimately topple Babylon in an unexpected fashion. Cyrus the Great plays an extraordinary role, not only in secular history, but in the biblical imagination. Isaiah names him as an instrument of God. See Isaiah 45, and Ezra records Cyrus's decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple, Ezra 1. From the perspective of Israel's story, Cyrus's rise is a form of divine reversal. The conqueror becomes, in God's hands, an agent of restoration. The Book of Esther, set in the Persian court, then gives us a vivid testimony to Jewish survival and influence under Persian rule. Stories of providence, identity, and the fragile security of a people living under foreign kings. When we read these events together with Daniel's visions, a larger theological frame emerges. God is sovereign over kings and nations. Empires are instruments in a divine narrative, and the future, however it unfolds politically, is never outside of God's governance. Daniel 2 frames this theologically in a striking image. A giant statue of many metals, each part symbolizing a successive kingdom. Later, Daniel's visions of beasts, Daniel 7, and of the ram and the goat, Daniel 8, deepen the portrait, giving names and symbolic actions to those kingdoms. These visions are not merely historical report, they are theological interpretation. They insist that what looks like raw power is always under the judgment and the appointment of a higher divine will. But Daniel's portrait also introduces a dimension that many readers find unsettling and compelling, the spiritual counterpart to political power. In Daniel 10, the narrative opens with Daniel grieving and fasting over an unraveling of spiritual realities. He receives a vision of a heavenly messenger who explains that his coming was delayed because the prince of Persia resisted him for 21 days. This prince language, used elsewhere in Scripture to describe angelic or spiritual guardians over regions, suggests that earthly empires are often associated with spiritual forces. The messenger's struggle points to a battlefield not only of tanks and treaties, but of principalities and powers. This spiritual perspective will be crucial as we consider how ancient references to Persia might relate interpretatively to modern actors. Let me be clear. When I say Persia, I am referring to the historical empire that dominated the Near East after Babylon, what we commonly call Medo-Persia, not to make a direct political equation with the modern nation-state of Iran without careful qualifications. There is legitimate continuity in geography and in cultural memory, but modern Iran is a complex, recent political reality with ideologies, borders, and institutions that differ significantly from ancient Persia. Throughout this discussion, we must hold in tension the patterns of prophecy and the particularities of contemporary geopolitics, always labeling interpretive connections as interpretive and provisional. Pause for a moment and imagine the map that an ancient prophet would have seen, a world dominated by a few great centers, Babylon, Lydia, Egypt, Persia, each exerting control over wide territories. For the biblical authors, those centers were both political powers and theological symbols. Yet the prophets were not primarily writing a street-by-street geographical intelligence report. They were interpreting history theologically. When Daniel envisions metal upon metal, or beasts rising from the sea, his concern is to show how God's plan transcends and judges imperial pride. This brings us to a further story strand, the restoration of Israel. The exile and return are not peripheral details. They are the backdrop for Ezekiel's prophecies and for later texts that imagine Israel not as a defeated appendage of history, but as a restored, worshipping community. After the return, which Ezra and Nehemiah narrate with foundational encouragement from Cyrus, the notion of Israel living in security and rebuilding its religious life becomes a premise for later prophetic visions of conflict and vindication. Ezekiel 38:39, for instance, imagines a dramatic assault on a restored Israel. A leader named Gog, from the land of Magog, will gather a coalition that includes Persia. The text is emphatic about the condition of Israel before this attack. It is dwelling securely, restored from the nations, and then this coalition moves against it. Ezekiel's purpose is not mere geopolitical forecasting. It is theological. God will act to demonstrate his holiness and to make his name known among the nations. See Ezekiel 38:23. When some contemporary interpreters read Ezekiel and see echoes of modern geopolitics, they point to the presence of Persia in the coalition list as particularly striking. But again, caution is required. Ancient lists of nations do not map neatly onto modern borders. Names shift meaning across centuries. Nonetheless, the presence of Persia in Ezekiel's roster invites a pause. If an ancient prophecy imagines Persia in such a role, how should we weigh that with present realities in which a modern nation in that same geography expresses hostility toward Israel and forms alliances in the region? A second layer of interpretive care comes when we move from Ezekiel to the New Testament. The book of Revelation revives the imagery of Gog and Magog, notably in Revelation 20:7-8, where a massive gathering from the four corners of the earth is described in a final rebellion against the people of God. A point of clarification worth making up front. Some discussions mistakenly reference Revelation 28 when pointing to these chapters. The correct New Testament reference for Gog and Magog material is Revelation 20:7-8. John's apocalyptic vision borrows language and patterns from earlier prophets, repeating the motif of a coalition gathered against God's people only to be met by divine judgment. The repetition suggests pattern more than a GPS-style pinpointing of actors. Even Jesus, in his eschatological teaching, warned his followers to expect wars and rumors of wars without giving national labels. See Matthew 24, Luke 21. His words frame conflict as part of an unfolding set of signs, some local, some global, that invite watchfulness and discernment, not panic or certainty. The hermeneutic principle here is to read prophetic texts with humility. Look for patterns, not for a checklist that translates uncritically into modern headlines. So how do we handle the mapping from Persia to modern Iran? There are a few methodological guardrails to keep in mind. First, recognize that many scholars accept a degree of continuity between ancient Persia and the territory of modern Iran. The Iranian plateau was central to Persian imperial power. That said, political identity is not static. Languages, religions, rulers, and borders have changed repeatedly. Second, be precise in our language. When we say some suggest or many interpreters identify, we are signaling interpretation, not revelation. Third, avoid assigning motives to ancient prophetic names as if the Bible had handed down a modern political manifesto. The biblical texts are theological and symbolic at their core, even as they reference real peoples and places. Having laid that groundwork, let's return to Daniel and walk through his visions more closely, because they provide a hermeneutical key for reading later prophetic scenes. Daniel 2 presents the statue dream: a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly of bronze, legs of iron, and feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Interpreters long ago associated these layers with successive empires: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, or later powers, and the mixed kingdoms that follow. The image concludes with a stone not cut by human hands, striking the statue and growing into a mountain that fills the whole earth, an unmistakable expression of God's kingdom breaking in. The point is theological. History's empires are transient and subject to the coming reign of God. Daniel 7 complements the statue with a dream of beasts, each beast representing an empire through grotesque and vivid traits: a lion with eagle's wings, a bear raised on one side, a four-headed leopard, and a terrifying iron-toothed beast. The beast's succession accelerates the sense of increasing severity and fragmentation, and the final beast is given authority until the Ancient of Days intervenes. This vision, read alongside the statue, paints an arc from imperial grandeur to divine judgment and ultimate vindication. Daniel 8 sharpens the focus with the ram and the goat, a more precise pairing. The ram has two horns, one higher than the other. A common understanding links this to Media and Persia, with Persia emerging dominant. The goat, with a single conspicuous horn, representing the first king of Greece, commonly identified as Alexander the Great, charges from the west and breaks the ram. The goat's horn then becomes broken, and in its place rise four horns, an image often understood as the division of Alexander's empire. Daniel 8 also contains an angelic explanation in the heavenly court, underscoring that these movements of kingdoms have both earthly and heavenly dimensions. The angelic realm comes to the fore in Daniel 10. In this chapter, Daniel's vision includes a messenger who explains the delay of his arrival. He had been contending with the prince of Persia, and only with the intervention of Michael, one of the chief princes, was he sent to Daniel, Daniel 10:13-20. The language here of princes over nations suggests a structured spiritual order with angelic figures assigned to regions, figures who can influence, obstruct, or facilitate events. The messenger's struggle is almost cinematic. It reveals a divine council in motion, with spiritual impediments that must be overcome for God's purposes to be revealed to his prophet. What are we to make of this spiritual language? It does not mean that political leaders are merely supernatural puppets. Rather, it suggests that history has spiritual dimensions that theology must not ignore. If there are principalities and powers that oppose God's will, then political conflicts may have a spiritual substrate that requires prayer, discernment, and humility from God's people. This does not license paranoia or the condemnation of entire peoples. It calls for sober, spiritual realism that moves beyond simplistic geopolitics. A mini-hook, then. If Daniel portrays Persia as having a spiritual prince and suggests a heavenly struggle over nations, What would that imply for reading prophetic passages that name Persia as an actor in future conflict? Does the presence of Persia in Ezekiel's list point to the same spiritual dynamic, a regional power associated with a corresponding spiritual principality? And how should that inform our interpretation when modern Iran, whose leadership and foreign policy since 1979 have expressed explicit hostility to the state of Israel, appears in headlines as a geopolitical antagonist? Several interpretive approaches coexist within scholarship and among careful teachers. Some read Ezekiel and Daniel as primarily symbolic, focusing on theological truths about God's sovereignty and the futility of human coalition building against divine purposes. Others allow for a more concrete reading, suggesting that particular regions and their modern successors may play recognizable roles within the prophetic pattern. Still others urge restraint, emphasizing that prophetic texts often use ancient toponyms to convey theological truth without promising a direct modern counterpart. It is also important to bring a corrective note regarding a repeated mistake in public discussion. When people look for a New Testament parallel to Ezekiel's Gog and Magog, they sometimes cite a non-existent chapter in Revelation. The correct New Testament reference for the Gog and Magog motif is Revelation 27-8, where the book of Revelation imagines a vast, final rebellion gathered after the millennium. This repetition of the theme, nations assembling against God's people and being answered by divine judgment, reinforces the pattern that runs through the prophetic corpus. Yet John's vision is not a literal map. It is apocalyptic literature that speaks in symbols and cosmic imagery. As we press deeper into these texts, one theological anchor must remain central: God's sovereignty. Daniel's visions, Ezekiel's warnings, John's apocalypse, all circle around a single theological claim. What appears as chaos and the triumph of human powers is finally within the scope of divine sovereignty. Daniel 2 says it plainly: God removes kings and sets up kings. Daniel 2:21. Ezekiel insists that God will act so that the nations know his name. Ezekiel 38:23. These are not mere consolatory statements. They are the interpretive lens through which prophecy must be read. The purpose of prophecy is not to create geopolitical alarmism, but to disclose God's purposes and to call his people to faithful response. That faithful response has both intellectual and practical dimensions. Intellectually, it requires disciplined exegesis, reading texts in their historical linguistic context, recognizing genre, and resisting the temptation to make every ancient term an airtight modern equivalent. Practically, it means cultivating watchfulness without fear, engaging in prayerful discernment, and acting with compassion toward people who, despite their leaders or policies, bear the image of God. We must also engage with the contemporary facts on the ground in a way that respects both biblical patterns and the complexity of modern international relations. It is indisputable that the State of Israel, re-established in 1948, is a restored political entity, and that since 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran has often positioned itself rhetorically and through proxy actors in opposition to Israeli interests. The United States has for decades been a key strategic ally to Israel. These are facts of modern geopolitics. Some interpreters see echoes between these facts and the patterns described in Ezekiel and Daniel. Others caution that such echoes do not constitute direct fulfillment. Where we step from biblical pattern to modern identification, we must do so as careful interpreters, explicitly marking our inferences as interpretive rather than declarative. At this juncture, many viewers will be asking, what does all this mean for the present moment? If Daniel envisions spiritual resistance over Persia, if Ezekiel names Persia in a coalition against restored Israel, and if Revelation repeats the motif of nations rallied against God's people, then how should believers in the United States, Israel, or Iran think and pray? The answer is not simple, but it begins with two commitments. First, refuse the temptation to read prophecy like a geopolitical press release. Instead, read it as theological narrative that interprets history. Second, live in a posture of prayerful engagement. Intercede for peace, for justice, and for the gospel to reach those who currently live in enmity or confusion. Let me offer a concrete example of how exegesis shapes ethics. In Ezekiel 38-39, the prophetic scene ends not with celebration of national triumph, but with God's act to make his name known, judging the invaders so that the nations see the Lord's holiness. That theological point reframes how believers should view conflict. The ultimate concern is not victory for one nation over another, but the vindication of God's justice and the revelation of his character. Therefore, Christians should avoid sectarian triumphalism that confuses political victory with spiritual righteousness. Instead, the biblical imagination calls for prayers that God would be glorified, that life and dignity would be preserved where possible, and that the gospel would find its way into hearts shaped by sectarian narratives. A second practical consequence concerns the posture of geopolitical interpretation. When discussing modern Iran, Israel and the United States in prophetic terms, use careful language. Say, some interpreters suggest, or a commonly held view is, and then present alternatives. Many scholars caution against literalist mapping. Others propose specific correspondences. This honest pluralism preserves both theological conviction and scholarly humility. It also protects the Church from the twin dangers of complacent fatalism, where prophecy becomes an excuse not to pray or act for peace, and of frantic sensationalism that trades on fear. Returning now to the heart of Daniel's visions, notice how they combine political insight with heavenly courtroom drama. The statue, the beasts, the ram and goat, and the prince of Persia together suggest a two-tiered reality. Kingdoms that shake the earth, and a heavenly reality that orders, resists, and eventually judges those kingdoms. The spiritual resistance personified by the Prince of Persia is especially provocative. If nations have spiritual counterparts, then our response cannot be purely diplomatic. Prayer, intercession, and spiritual discernment become not optional extras, but necessary companions to wise political engagement. Yet neither spirituality nor politics should be absolutized to the exclusion of the other. Biblical wisdom calls for both sober realism and faith. At the end of Daniel 10, the messenger indicates that Michael, one of the chief princes, would come to assist, Daniel 10:13. That reference to Michael helps us see that heavenly intervention is not arbitrary, but organized and purposeful. It suggests that the God who rules over empires does so with order and intention. The theological implication is heavy. Human agency matters within God's providential plan. Prayer and faithful action are part of the means God uses to accomplish his ends. This understanding should shape Christian engagement. We pray because it matters. We act because God uses means. And we trust God because his sovereignty is the horizon of history. We are now at a pivotal interpretive threshold. Daniel has shown that empires come and go, and that spiritual realities accompany political shifts. Ezekiel will take the restoration of Israel as the stage for a future coalition that includes Persia. Revelation will echo the motif in an apocalyptic context. Jesus frames the ultimate pattern as one that calls believers to watch and to endure. These threads are converging on a point of tension. If ancient names like Persia appear in prophetic lists, if spiritual principalities are part of the biblical vision, and if modern headlines name Iran in opposition to Israel while the United States remains a critical ally, then how do we faithfully connect the dots without drawing lines the text will not support? That question opens the next chapter of our exploration. We have laid the historical groundwork, traced Daniel's visions and their spiritual implications, and marked the theological guardrails that must shape any modern mapping. What remains is to turn directly to Ezekiel 38:39 and the detailed picture it paints, a picture that has sparked intense debate because of its explicit naming of nations, including Persia. We will examine the conditions Ezekiel cites for the invasion, the identity questions that arise from the list of nations, and the theological purpose behind God's dramatic intervention. Only by reading Ezekiel carefully, attending to genre, to the text's concrete markers, and to the interpretive options, can we responsibly evaluate whether and how those ancient words might illuminate contemporary tensions involving Iran, Israel, and the United States. We turn now to Ezekiel 38:39 itself, the corridor in Scripture where the prophecy names a leader called Gog, from the land of Magog, marshalling an array of peoples that explicitly includes Persia, Ezekiel 38:5. Read in its immediate context. Ezekiel's oracle imagines a restored Israel, dwelling securely, Ezekiel 38:8-11, suddenly targeted by a great confederation coming from the north. The prophecy supplies several concrete markers, a northern direction for the invaders, a list of participating nations, and a theological purpose for God's response. The text insists on the condition of Israel's restoration as the backdrop for the assault, and it frames God's decisive intervention as didactic, so that all nations will know the Lord's holiness, Ezekiel 38:16-23. What do these markers mean, and how do interpreters approach them? Broadly speaking, 4 interpretive families have shaped the conversation. One approach reads Ezekiel as largely symbolic or typological. The nations and images are theological patterns that reflect recurring human rebellion against God's people. Proponents of this view emphasize the prophecy's purpose, God's vindication and the unveiling of his name, over a literal modern mapping of each toponym. Another approach is historical. Some scholars locate the imagery in events closer to Ezekiel's own horizon or in patterns that recurred in the ancient Near East, treating the oracle as an exhortation to trust God amid immediate threats. A third, more literalist approach treats Ezekiel 38:39 as a future, concrete invasion yet to occur, often associated with end-time scenarios in which specific modern nations correspond to the named peoples. Finally, a mixed approach allows for historical resonance, symbolic theology, and the possibility of future fulfillment, arguing that prophetic texts can carry multiple layers of reference without collapsing into simple one-to-one identifications. Each of these approaches has strengths and weaknesses. The symbolic reading preserves the theological center, God's holiness and sovereignty, but risks depriving the text of its vivid historical coloring. The historicist readings can illuminate the prophecy's first-century relevance, but they may miss the text's sustained eschatological thrust. The literal futurist position often supplies a satisfying connect-the-dots map for modern readers, yet it can slip into overly precise identifications or political speculation that the text itself does not warrant. The mixed approach, careful, humble, and multi-layered, best honors both the biblical genre and the weight of the imagery, though it requires interpretive restraint. 2 textual features in Ezekiel 38:39 deserve close attention. First, the list of nations. Alongside Persia, Ezekiel names Put, Cush, Gomer, Togarmah, and others, Ezekiel 38:5-6. These names were familiar in the ancient world to indicate regions across North Africa, Ethiopia, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau. Yet precise, modern equivalents are debated. For instance, Put is commonly associated with Libya. Cush often refers to regions south of Egypt, modern Sudan or Ethiopia. Gomer and Togarmah are associated in ancient sources with peoples in Asia Minor and the Caucasus. Magog has been variously linked to the steppes north of the Black Sea, to Scythian groups, or to symbolic northern foes. Scholars differ, and rightly so, because ancient ethnonyms do not map neatly onto 20th or 21st century nation-state borders. Second, the motif of God's purpose. Ezekiel frames the invasion not as an end in itself, but as the occasion for a theophany. God acts so that the nations shall know me when I manifest my holiness. Ezekiel 38:23. The text repeatedly emphasizes that God intervenes with supernatural devastation, earthquakes, pestilence, and confusion, so that the world sees that the Lord, not the invading coalition, is sovereign. That theological conclusion reshapes how Christians should read any geoprophetic mapping. The point is primarily theological pedagogy, not a geopolitical victory celebration. Given these textual realities, how should we treat the presence of Persia in Ezekiel's list? At minimum, 3 prudential notes are necessary. First, acknowledge the continuity. The geographic core of ancient Persia lies within what is roughly today Iran, and many commentators accept a basic territorial continuity. Second, stress the difference. Modern Iran is the product of complex historical processes. Arab conquests, Islamic transformation, dynastic changes, imperial interventions, and modern nation-state formation. So the term Persia carries cultural historical weight rather than automatic political equivalence. Third, label identification as interpretive. When linking Ezekiel's Persia to the Islamic Republic of Iran, say clearly that this is an interpretive hypothesis rather than a canonical assertion. Moving from the ancient text into the New Testament, remember that John's apocalyptic vision in Revelation 20:7-8 picks up the Gog and Magog motif and transposes it into his eschatological panorama. After a period of restraint, a final rebellion gathers from the 4 corners of the earth to surround the camp of the saints. Here again, the pattern repeats. Armies gather against God's people. God answers. As with Ezekiel, Revelation's imagery is apocalyptic, symbolic, cosmic, and categorical. John borrows the pattern to depict the ultimate futility of human opposition to divine purposes. Where some have miscited the scene as Revelation 28, let the record stand corrected. The relevant passage is Revelation 20:7-8. That correction matters because careful citation supports careful interpretation. Jesus' teaching in the Gospels offers a hermeneutical frame for these prophetic motifs. Matthew 24 and Luke 21 place wars, famines, earthquakes, and persecutions within a larger horizon of signs. Jesus refuses to supply a catalogue of nations and instead calls for watchfulness, endurance, and faithfulness. His emphasis is pastoral. Vigilance and rootedness in the kingdom ethic matter more than geopolitical speculation. That pastoral tone should govern our response today as we weigh ancient prophecy against modern headlines. So what does a careful, humble mapping of ancient Persia to modern Iran look like in practice? Start from data rather than assumption. Fact: the Iranian plateau served as the heartland of the Achaemenid Empire. The name Persia has long cultural and historical continuity with that land. Fact: since the 1979 revolution, the Islamic Republic of Iran has adopted rhetoric and policies often hostile to the State of Israel. Iran supports non-state actors in the region who frequently clash with Israeli interests. Iran's nuclear ambitions, regional alliances, and strategic competition contribute to contemporary tensions. Fact: the United States has been a long-standing strategic partner of Israel, shaping alliances, deterrence postures, and diplomatic calculations in the region. These are observable, non-prophetic realities. Where interpretation enters is when we ask, do these facts constitute the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy? Some careful teachers affirm a correspondence in broad strokes. Persia's presence in the ancient list mirrors a modern state in that geography that has hostile posture toward Israel. Others caution that such a correspondence is speculative and that Ezekiel's list must be read with its symbolic, theological purpose uppermost. The honest posture for a Bible-teaching Christian is to present both possibilities, to give reasons for each, and to resist transforming a plausible correspondency into doctrine. It is also important to widen the lens beyond direct nation-to-nation mapping and attend to the spiritual categories Daniel and Ezekiel invoke. Daniel 10's Prince of Persia suggests that regional struggles may have spiritual counterparts. This theological claim does not demonize peoples. Rather, it situates conflict within a cosmic battlefield that requires prayer, spiritual discernment, and ethical engagement. Ephesians 6's language about spiritual forces and principalities complements this vision. Spiritual realities undergird human affairs, and Christians are called to stand with truth, righteousness, and prayer, not to foment hatred or sing political triumphalism. At the level of pastoral counsel, several practical commitments follow. First, cultivate sober watchfulness. The Bible calls believers to be aware of signs and to live prudently without succumbing to panic. Watchfulness means praying informedly, praying for wisdom for leaders, for protection for civilians, and for the means of reconciliation, while resisting sensational speculation. It also means supporting humanitarian care for those harmed by conflict, refugees, families displaced, and communities whose livelihoods are shattered. Second, practice interpretive humility. When discussing prophetic texts in relation to modern states, qualify assertions and present alternative scholarly views. A helpful pattern is, some interpreters argue X, others argue Y. Here's the reason I find X compelling, and here are the objections. That pattern fosters intellectual honesty and pastoral integrity. Third, resist dehumanizing rhetoric. The prophetic texts name nations, but Scripture never condones the mistreatment of peoples. Christians must differentiate between criticizing policies or warning about geopolitical threats and denigrating whole populations or religions. Loving one's neighbor and praying for one's enemies remain central commands. See Matthew 5:44. Fourth, invest in prayerful engagement that is specific. Prayer can be general, but it is most faithful when it prays for concrete needs. Protection for innocent civilians, hearts changed by the gospel, repentance where injustice has occurred, and wisdom for policymakers. Pray for those within Iran who face repression, for Israeli citizens living under threat, for American leaders navigating complex alliances. That prayer is neither naive nor partisan. It is faithful. Fifth, equip yourself with disciplined study. For those who want to navigate this terrain responsibly, read Ezekiel 38-39 and Daniel 10 carefully. Consult a range of commentaries, including critical, conservative, and historically minded voices. And study modern history so that biblical interpretation is informed by facts rather than headlines alone. Recommended reading is varied, and a balanced reading list should include commentaries on Ezekiel, studies on prophetic literature and apocalyptic genre, and sober works on Middle Eastern political history. It is worth pausing to imagine how these commitments play out in individual life. A Christian in the United States might follow the news with discernment, pray for policymakers and for the vulnerable, and use civic means, letters, votes, peaceful advocacy, to promote humane policy without turning political identity into theological identity. A believer in Israel might read Ezekiel with a sense of deep hope and sober dependence on God, resisting the temptation to equate national security with spiritual election. A follower of Christ in Iran, where Christian communities often face restriction, may find in these texts the assurance that God is sovereign over empires, even as they pray for protection and opportunity to bear witness. Returning to the theological center, why does God allow such dramatic scenes to be imagined in prophecy? Ezekiel's answer is strikingly pastoral and missionary. God acts so that the nations will know him. These prophecies at their core are not military strategy papers, but theology. They rehearse a conviction that the Lord, who governs history, is ultimately intent on revealing his holiness and justice so that the world might turn to him. The prophetic images of judgment serve an evangelistic and revelatory purpose. God's purpose is restoration and recognition, not mere national triumphalism. As we conclude, let's bring the threads together in a balanced synthesis. The Bible presents a pattern. Empires rise and fall. Spiritual forces accompany human politics. God remains sovereign. Daniel's visions, Ezekiel's oracle, and John's apocalypse form a theological web that invites Christians to read history with eyes attuned to both earthly facts and heavenly realities. Mapping Persia to modern Iran is a defensible interpretive move in broad terms, given geographic continuity, but it requires humility and nuance because the biblical texts are theological and symbolic, and modern nation-states are historically complex. Revelation's reprise of Gog and Magog, Revelation 27-8, confirms the motif's eschatological function, and Jesus' teaching, Matthew 24, Luke 21, reminds us that watchfulness and faithfulness are the primary Christian responses. Therefore, when you see headlines mentioning Iran, Israel, and the United States, consider three things. First, soberly track the geopolitical facts. Second, read the biblical patterns without importing into them modern political agendas. Third, pray and act in ways that reflect Christ's compassion and the Church's call to be instruments of peace. Prophecy should energize prayer, sharpen discernment, and deepen dependence on God's providence. It should not debilitate the soul with fear or license the dehumanization of others. If this study has been helpful, and you want to go deeper, especially into the primary texts of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation, there are study packs and guided reading resources available in the description for those who wish to join a deeper course. For now, let us close with a measured blessing. May grace steady your heart, may wisdom guide your mind, and may prayer shape your actions as you watch history unfold under the Lord's sovereign hand. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support deeper, ongoing studies like this, consider joining our membership for exclusive lessons and resources. May the Lord grant us discernment, mercy for our neighbors, and courage to live as faithful witnesses in uncertain times.